Derbyshire, the Peak Country, in the autumn of 1817. There is a piece of wisdom in the lead country which every miner has by heart before his first winter is out, and which almost no gentleman ever learns at all. It is this, that water is the only creditor which never forgets, never dies, and cannot be put off with a civil letter. It will be paid. It will be paid in labor, or it will be paid in coal, or it will be paid in the whole of a family's fortune sent down a hole in a hill, a bucket at a time over 3 generations. But it will be paid. And the only man who ever beats it is the man who stops arguing with it altogether and shows it the door. Julian Ashcourt, 4th Duke of Herodin, had been arguing with water for 4 months, and losing, and had not the smallest notion that he was losing. This is a thing which happens to a great many clever men, and to almost no clever women, and the reason is not mysterious. The clever man asks what the water ought to do. The clever woman asks what the water has been doing since before the conquest, writes the answer down, and then makes her arrangements accordingly. Let her have the drowned mine, the Duke said, at the Michaelmas Barmote of that year, and the 24 sworn men of the jury laughed with him, because a duke's joke is always a good one. He signed her grant of the sough with his own hand, still laughing, and he signed it gladly, because the sough was impossible, and it costs a man nothing to be generous with an impossibility. 20 months later, he stood a mile inside that hill in the dark, in water to his boot-tops, with his hat off like a man in church, listening to the sound of his own ruin, walking quietly out of the ground and away down the dale, and he could not for the life of him remember what he had meant by it. But that is the far end of the account, and the lead country is very particular about beginnings. So we shall start where it started, which is with the hill. The liberty of Ashenhope lay in the high limestone, 9 miles from anywhere a carriage would willingly go, and it had been dug for lead since before anyone thought it worth writing down that it had been dug at all. The Romans had had it. The monks had had it. The hill was scarred from crest to dale bottom with the long, straight, grassy welts of the old rakes, running east and west across the moor like the ruled lines of a ledger somebody had abandoned half-posted, and between them stood the hillocks, the tips, the little ruined coes and the stows, pairs of upright oak posts over each shaft, weathered silver, each with its crosspiece and its windlass, each standing at the head of a hole that went down further than daylight had any business going. The whole of it was governed, and had been governed for 300 years, and probably twice that, not by the Duke, and not by Parliament, and not by anybody's opinion, but by the custom of the mine. The custom was old, unwritten, and entirely pitiless. It held that lead ore belonged to no man until it was found, that any person who found a vein within the liberty and brought word of it to the Barmaster might have that vein freed to him and take possession of it, and the lord of the field could not refuse, that the lord's whole right in the matter was to be paid, and that his payment was the 13th dish of all ore raised, which was called the lot, and a duty of 6pence upon every load, which was called the cope. It held that a man who did not work his mine forfeited it. The Barmaster came at the reckoning, and cut a nick in the stows with his hatchet, and at the 3rd nick the mine was another's, and no lawyer in England could do a thing about it. And it held above everything else that all ore whatsoever was to be measured in the Barmaster's brass dish, and in no other vessel on earth. The dish was the heart of the thing. It sat in the moot hall at Ashenhope, in an oak chest with 3 locks, and it was a plain, oblong brass trough, worn shallow and smooth as a spoon at the lip by 3 centuries of ore going through it, and it had been gauged, long ago, against the great standard dish that the crown had given the miners in the reign of the 8th Henry. 14 pints of ore, near enough, and 9 dishes to the load. Every parcel of bouse raised in the Liberty was measured in it. The Duke's ore was measured in it. A widow's oar, dug by her own 2 hands out of a scrin no wider than her arm, was measured in it. It was in a country arranged from top to bottom on the principle that a man's word was worth exactly as much as his acres, the one object for 9 miles about which was perfectly and stupidly impartial, and the miners loved it the way sailors love a lighthouse. The dish knew no names. It did not ask whose ore it measured. It filled to the lip and stopped, and there was no arguing with it, and no dining with it either. At the bottom of the dale, where the river Ashen ran shallow and grey over its own dead white stones, stood the cupola of Honor Hallam, smelter of lead, and it was here that the trouble started, though nobody recognized it as trouble at the time, trouble in the lead country being generally mistaken for weather. Hallam was 61, gouty, cheerful, unfashionable, and rich in the manner of a man who has been paid in pigs of lead for 40 years and never once been paid in compliments. He bought bouse at the mine mouths, washed it, smelted it in his reverberatory furnace, and sold it away down the turnpike as pig lead to Hull and to London. And he had done it so long that the whole Liberty's ore had passed under his eye, parcel by parcel, since the year the French king lost his head. He had 1 child living. He had had 4. He did not talk about the other 3, and he did not need to. The Dale did it for him. Miss Honor Hallam was 27 that autumn, which the neighborhood had long since agreed was a great pity, and had said so with the perfect kindness of people who have nothing whatever at stake. She was not a beauty in the way the county understood beauties. Being too still for it, she was dark, straight-backed, unhurried, with her hair in a plain braided crown, because a braided crown does not come down when you are leaning over a buddle, and she had a way of listening to a man all the way to the end of his sentence, which several gentlemen had mistaken for admiration and afterwards had cause to reconsider. Her fingers were stained, not with the ladylike smudge of a letter-writer, either. Her right forefinger and thumb carried a permanent grey-black shadow that no lemon and no gloves had ever entirely lifted, being the mark of 11 years of assay, of lead, and of ink, and of the 2 of them together. For that was the thing about Honor Hallam which the Dale knew and the county did not. She kept the book. Her father had put her to it at 16, not from any theory about the education of women, of which he had none, but because his own hand had begun to shake, and hers had not. Every parcel of bouse that came to the Ashenhope cupola was entered by her. The day, the mine, the vein it came out of, the man who brought it, the number of dishes, the price given. And then, because Josiah Hallam paid by the lead and not by the look of the stone, every parcel was assayed, a little of it ground, weighed, wrapped in lead foil, driven off in a bone ash cupel in the little assay furnace at the end of the counting house, and the bright bead of metal that came out at the last, weighed on a beam so fine that a fly's wing would have turned it. And that number, too, went into the book. 11 years of it. 9,000 and some hundred parcels. The whole hill, in ink in one hand, entered by the day and cross ruled by the vane. Nobody in England had that book but her, and nobody in England, so far as she could discover, had ever thought to ask her for it. The Duke came into the country in the June of that year, in blacks, at 34, and he came into it the way a man comes into a room where somebody has died, quietly, and with a strong disinclination to touch anything. Julian Ashcourt had not expected the dukedom for another 15 years, and had spent his life on the assumption that his part in the world was to be the clever, cool, rather sardonic younger brother of it. Then his brother's horse had come down at a wall in Leicestershire, and 11 weeks after that his father had gone in his chair without any fuss at all, and Julian had opened the estate books at Harrowden with a candle at his elbow, and found that his family had for 3 generations been engaged in a duel with an underground lake, and had been losing it at an average of rather better than £3,000 a year. He was, to be fair to him, exactly the sort of man who reads such a book to the end. He was proud, precise, sparing with himself, and rationed in his feelings the way careful men are rationed, having decided early that a feeling is a debt you cannot enter in any column. He was not cruel. Nobody in the county ever accused him of that, not even afterwards. He simply had a way of settling a question in his own mind and then treating anybody who reopened it as a species of noise. And the question he had settled, by the end of that first fortnight with the candle, was the great rake. The great rake at Harrowden was the mine. It had been the family's whole fortune since the second Duke, and it was drowning. It had always been drowning, that was the nature of it. The vein went down through the limestone into the water, and the water came back up through the vein into the workings, and for 40 years the Ashcourts had answered the water with an engine. There was a Bolton and Watt at the shaft head with a 45-inch cylinder, and it stood there day and night hauling the hill's water up 400 feet in a bucket and pouring it out on the moor, from which, in the fullness of time and with the patience of the eternal, it soaked back down into the mine. The engine ate coal. The coal came 19 miles over the moor from the Loyne pits at Stanage, by cart, in all weathers, at a cost which that year came to £3,800, and which had never once in 40 years come to less than the year before. His father's answer to this had been to sink deeper. His grandfather's answer had been to sink deeper, and his agent's answer, delivered in the smooth and sorrowful voice of a man who has said the same thing for 11 years and been right every time because he made sure of it, was to sink deeper and to marry coal. Mr. Ephraim Verrall had been mineral agent to the Harrowden estate since the old Duke's day. He was 50, tidy, deferential, and universally considered sound, that being the word the county used for men whose errors it had not yet troubled to add up. It was Verrall who brought the Duke the plan of the workings, and Verrall who explained with a pencil why the only cure was the engine, and Verrall who observed, delicately over the port, that Mr. Loyne of Stanage had a daughter, and that the coal which was presently costing his Grace £3,800 a year might be got, by the right arrangement, for nothing at all. It was not Verrall who mentioned that he had for 9 years taken a commission of 4pence upon every ton of Loyne coal that crossed the moor, through a cousin in the carrying trade at Bakewell, nor that this commission had, in the last 12-month, been worth rather more than his salary. A man does not clutter a plan with irrelevancies, so the Duke came to the Michaelmas Barmote of 1817 with the whole thing settled, the engine, the coal, and in due course Miss Georgiana Loyne, who was 22 and had a pleasant face and £40,000, and a father who wanted a coronet in the family the way other men want a hunter. The Barmote sat twice a year in the Moot Hall at Ashenhope, and it sat that day, as it had sat since the reign of Edward I, the steward of the court, Mr. Deacon, at the head of the long oak table, the Barmaster, Mr. Rowland Frith, at his right hand with the great book open before him, the jury of 24 sworn miners on the benches down both sides in their good coats, smelling of tobacco and stone, the lord of the field in the chair at the end, present because the lot and the cope were his, and for no other reason whatever. The room was low, black-beamed, and full of the particular light you get in the peak in September, which is the colour of skimmed milk. The oak chest with the 3 locks stood open. The brass dish lay on the table in front of the Barmaster, where it always lay, because in that room it outranked everybody sitting round it. They had got through the pleas and the trespasses and a dispute about a boundary stone at Cold Comfort that had been running since before the peace. And then Mr. Deacon came to the sets standing forfeit and vacant in the Liberty, and offered them, as the custom required, to any man who would have them. Nobody would have them. Nobody ever did. Sorrowful Grove, said Mr. Deacon, without hope. Drowned in the year 1789. Nicked 3 times in the year 91. Standing vacant in the Lord's hand these 26 years. Will any man free it? And Miss Honor Hallam, sitting at the back of the hall in a grey pelisse beside her father, on the bench where the smelters and the chapmen sat, because they had business with the court and no voice in it, stood up. There is no describing the silence. It was not hostile. It was the silence of 24 men who have all simultaneously decided to look at the table. I will free it, she said. Miss Frith, the Barmaster, did not look at the table. He was 68, and he had been Barmaster for 31 years, and he had a face like the end of a hammer, and he had spent his whole life in the service of a custom which did not care what he thought either. He drew the book towards him. Name, he said. Honor Hallam. Of Ashenhope. You have found lead within the Liberty? I have found it in Sorrowful Grove, sir, and I can show it to you where it stands. There is bouse on the hillock now that would go 1100 weight of lead to the load, and it has been lying out in the rain since 1789, because the men who raised it drowned before they could carry it down. That is so, said Mr. Frith, who had known it was so for 26 years, and had waited that long for anybody to say it out loud. The custom is the custom. Any person that finds it may free it. Is there any man here will speak against? There was not. There was instead a general and comfortable stir along the benches, of the kind a congregation makes when it perceives that the sermon is going to be entertaining after all. And then Miss Hallam, still standing, said the second thing. And I ask leave of the court, she said, to drive a sough to it. On the custom of the Liberty, at my own charge, and at the customary duty. To understand what she had just asked for, one must understand a sough. And to understand a sough, one must first give up the idea that a mine is a hole. A mine is an argument with water. Every deep working in the lead country is a bucket standing in a stream, and every generation of the men who own it must decide afresh how the bucket is to be emptied. There are 3 answers only. You may lift the water out with men and go bankrupt slowly. You may lift it out with an engine and go bankrupt in comfort. Or you may go down to the valley a mile off and 400 feet lower and drive a tunnel into the hillside and drive it through the living limestone on a rise of 1 inch in the chain for years, until at last you come up under the drowned workings from below and hole into them, and then the water does not need to be lifted at all. It walks out. It walks out of the hill by itself, in the dark for nothing, forever, at the speed of a man strolling, and it never stops, and it never sends in a bill. That is a sough. There were perhaps a dozen of them in Derbyshire, and each one was a monument to some obstinate dead man who had spent his whole life and most of his money on a hole that came out in a field. And because a sough drains not only the mine of the man who drove it, but every working the water of which it draws, because the water under a hill is all one water, and does not consult the boundary stones. The custom of the lead country had long ago settled what the man who drove it should have for his pains, and it had settled it generously, on the sound and cynical principle that no one would ever do it otherwise. The sough took the 9th dish, 1 dish in every 9 of all ore, raised from every mine it unwatered, for as long as the water ran, measured at the reckoning, in the Barmaster's brass dish, at the mine mouth, before the Lord's 13th was counted at all. Before the Lord's. Mr. Deacon, the steward, took off his spectacles. Mr. Frith turned back 3 pages in the book, laid his finger on an entry made in the reign of Queen Anne, and read it in the flat voice of a man reading the burial service, and it said what she had said it said. And the Duke of Heroden laughed. It was not, in justice, a sneer. He was better bred than a sneer. It was the honest, delighted, wholly unguarded laugh of a tired and worried man to whom something genuinely funny has happened at the end of a long morning, and the whole hall heard it, and every man on the benches turned to look at him, because the Lord of the field had never once laughed in that room, in living memory. "Forgive me," he said. "Forgive me. Miss Hallam, is it? Hallam of the cupola. I do not doubt for a moment that you keep your father's books very prettily. But do you know what you are asking? 1,400 yards of hard limestone. My engineer costs it at £11 the yard and 9 years of driving. And my engineer has spent his life at it, and you have spent yours at a counter weighing other men's stone with a pair of tweezers. There are 24 men in this room who have been underground since they were boys, and not one of them would touch it. My own father would not touch it. And he was not a cautious man, he was merely a poor one, at the end. A sough is not an entry in a ledger, ma'am. It is a mile of rock and 20 years of a man's life. And it wants a nerve I would not wish on you, and an arithmetic I do not believe you possess. He said it, remember, kindly. That is the part the county could never afterwards get straight in the telling. He was not putting her down, he was, in his own mind, saving her, and he thought it rather handsome of him to take the trouble. Let her have the drowned mine, he said, turning back to the steward, and he was still smiling. Let her have it, with my blessing, and the sough too, and the 9th of all it ever draws, and I hope she may drain the whole of Derbyshire with it. Enter it, Miss Frith. I will sign it myself. It is the cheapest generosity I shall ever be offered, and I would not miss it for £100. And the 24 laughed. And Mr. Verrall, standing at his master's shoulder with the plan of the workings under his arm, laughed too, and it is worth recording that his was the only laugh in that room with any malice in it, and that it was also the only one anybody afterwards forgave, because the county understood malice perfectly, and could never quite understand what the Duke had done. Mr. Frith did not laugh. He dipped his pen. "In whose name is the suff to be entered?" he said. Honor Hallam had not sat down. She had not coloured either. She stood at the back of the moot hall with her hands folded in front of her, and she waited until the laughter had run all the way out, the way you wait for a bell to stop, and then she gave the Barmaster her answer in a voice that carried to the table without ever once being raised. "Hallam's suff," she said. The Duke signed it. He signed it with his own hand, at the foot of the entry, in the great book that Mr. Frith turned round on the table for him. And the 24 sworn men of the jury put their names and their marks beneath his as witnesses, because that is what the custom requires. And the custom, having no sense of humour, does not distinguish between a grant made in earnest and a grant made for a laugh. Mr. Frith sonded it, and shut the book, and locked it in the chest with the brass dish and the 3 locks, and that was the whole of it. 9 lines of ink and a signature, and the funniest thing that had happened at Ashenhope in 20 years. Miss Hallam curtsied to the court. It was a very good curtsy, exact, unhurried, of precisely the depth the occasion required and not 1 degree deeper. And then she took her father's arm, and they went out of the moot hall into the milk-white September light and down the street to the cupola, and she did not say anything until they had reached the counting-house door. "Well," said Josiah Hallam. "Well," said his daughter. "He is not a bad man," said her father, who was fair-minded to the point of inconvenience. "No," said Honor. "He is a man who has settled a question. It is not the same thing, Papa, but it does the same work." And then she went in, and hung up her pelisse, and lit the candles, because the days were drawing in, and took down from the shelf the 11th volume of the assay-book, and opened it at the page she had marked with a slip of card 3 weeks before, and she sat down at the counter, and began in her stained and steady hand to make out an order for 400 yards of 1-inch rope. Something has been left out of that scene. It was left out of every telling of it in the county for the next 3 years, too, and for the same reason everybody present was laughing, and a room that is laughing hears nothing at all. Before she curtsied, Miss Hallam had said 1 thing more. She had said it to the Barmaster, not to the Duke, in the flat and formal manner of a person entering a caution. And Mr. Frith, who was not laughing, and whose whole office and religion was the writing down of things, had dipped his pen again, and written it into the great book underneath the grant, above the 24 names. What she said was this: "Let the court note that in my judgment the water of Sorrowful Grove and the water of his Grace's great rake are one water, and that a suff which draws the one will draw the other, and that the 9th will lie upon both." I would not have it said afterwards that I had not told you, Mr. Verrall had said, without waiting to be asked, that this was nonsense, that the great rake lay 3/4 of a mile off across 2 faults, and stood on its own water entirely, and that the lady had evidently been reading the wrong sort of book. And the Duke had said quite, in the pleasant, unlistening voice of a man already thinking about his dinner, and had signed, "It is all in the book. It has been in the book from that day to this. 9 lines of grant, 4 lines of caution, 1 ducal signature, 24 marks, and the date, the last day of September, 1817. Mr. Frith locked the chest and put the keys in his pocket, and went home to his supper, and if he permitted himself, on the walk up the hill, one short private observation to the effect that he had been Barmaster for 31 years, and had just watched a duke give away his own house, because a woman had asked for it politely. That is between Mr. Frith and the hill. Now the arithmetic. The Duke had not been wrong about the 1400 yards. Every engineer in Derbyshire had costed Ashenhope at 1400 yards, from the Dale bottom to the Sorrowful workings, because that is the distance, and there is no arguing with a chain. Where the Duke was wrong, where Verral was wrong and Ferrers was wrong, and every man who had ever looked at that hill and shuddered was wrong, was in supposing that the 1400 yards had to be dug. 930 of them had been dug already, by dead men, 60 years ago. This is what 11 years of assay books will tell you if you have the patience to ask them a question they were not written to answer. Honor Hallam had not gone looking for a sough. She had gone looking in the March of that year, for the reason her father's bouse price had a wobble in it, a small, regular, senseless wobble, of a few shillings, that came and went and would not explain itself. And to find it she had done the only thing nobody else had ever had the material to do. She had taken 11 years of parcels, 9,240 of them, and copied them out again on long sheets, and ruled them not by the mine, as her father kept them, but by the day. And the hill sat up and spoke to her. Because when you rule Ashenhope by the day, this is what you see. In the wet March of 1809, Cold Comfort stopped sending bouse on the 11th, and Bright Hope stopped on the 12th, and Slack and Idle stopped on the 12th, and the little scrin workings above Miser's Grove stopped on the 14th, and the great rake at Harrowden put on 4 extra men at the engine on the 13th, and burned 200 tons of coal in a fortnight that ought to have lasted it 5 weeks. And in the dry August of 1812 they all started again, in the same order within 9 days of one another. And in 1810 and 13 and 15 and 16, the same, every time. 11 years of it. 5 sets and a Duke's engine, all rising and falling together like the pans of a balance, because they were not 5 mines and an engine at all. They were one lake with 6 names on it. The old men had holed into one another for 100 years, chasing the same rake east and west through the same limestone, breaking through into each other's gates and cursing and putting up a stopping and going on, and when the water beat them one after another, and the stoppings rotted and burst, the whole east end of the hill had quietly become a single body of standing water in a honeycomb of other people's tunnels, and it stood, as water does, at one level everywhere, the level of the lowest hole in the honeycomb, which was the head of Ferrers' Sof. Misty. Anthony Ferrers of Chesterfield had begun his Soph in 1789, in the sound belief that he would be rich, and had driven it 1190 yards into the hill, straight true arched in stone, on a rise of 1 inch in the chain, before his money ran out and his wits went after it, and he died in 1791, mad, poor, and 210 yards short. 210. The tunnel was standing there still, dry, open, and perfect, its mouth in a hazel thicket a mile below the town, with a drift of dead leaves in it, and a shelf of fern growing out of the arch, and it had been standing there for 26 years, while the county rode past it to look at the Duke's engine. 210 yards of rock between Ferrers dead sough and a lake with 6 names on it. 21 shillings and a bit of blasting powder to the yard, and it went out. All of it. Forever. She bought the hill for £43 and 11 shillings. That is not a figure of speech, that is the sum, and she entered it. And it may be seen still. Ferrers sough itself, with all right, member and appurtenance thereof, from Mrs. Anne Peach of Chesterfield, granddaughter of the deceased, for £15, Mrs. Peach enclosing a very kind letter, in which she hoped Miss Hallam might have better fortune than grandpapa, who had died mad, and who had loved that hole better than his wife, slack and idle, forfeit and vacant, freed of the Barmaster for nothing. Bright hope from the 3 Bone brothers, who had gone to Sheffield to the file trade, and had been paying the cope on a drowned mine for 9 years out of pure Derbyshire obstinacy, for £12 and a promise. Miser's Grove, freed. Cold comfort from an old woman at Wardlow, who would take £9 for it and 100 weight of coal at Christmas, and got the coal every Christmas for the next 31 years, which was more than her mine had ever paid her. £43 and 11 shillings for 6 drowned mines, a madman's tunnel, and every fault, gate, sump, cross-cut and rotten stopping in the east end of Ashenhope Hill. The county, which had been laughing since Michaelmas, now laughed harder, and settled down comfortably to enjoy the winter. Mr. Verrall reported it all to his master, over the plans, itemized, with the prices, as a diverting instance of what happens when a tradesman's daughter is given her head, and the Duke of Heroden, who was at that moment writing to Mr. Loyne at Stanage about the coal contract and the other matter, laughed once, briefly, without looking up, and said that he hoped somebody would tell him when she reached the bottom of her father's money, as he should not like to see the old man hurt. Only Mr. Frith went out, on a cold blue morning in November, and walked the line of it himself, from the hazel thicket up to Sorrowful Stows, with her plan in his hand and his hat pushed back, and stood a long while at the top, with the wind coming over the moor, and said to nobody, in the voice of a man who has been shown a card he did not know was in the pack, "She isn't buying mines. She's buying a line." 210 yards is a short distance in a drawing room, and a long one in a hill. She did not ask her father for the money, which surprised him and hurt him a little until she explained, and then it stopped hurting him and started frightening him instead, because his daughter had been thinking again. A sough in Derbyshire is worked as a cost-book concern. The thing is divided into 24 shares, and the men who hold them pay the calls as the calls fall due, and take the dues when the dues come in. And if a man cannot pay his call, his share is sold at the next meeting to whoever will have it, and no feelings are consulted. It is the most brutal and most honest form of company ever devised in England, and it had the great advantage, for Honor Hallam's purposes, of requiring the consent of no bank, no trustee, no solicitor, and no man alive. She took 13 shares herself, and paid for them with 11 years of her own wages, which her father had entered honestly in the cupola books at £40 a year since she was 16, and which she had never once spent, and which came to £440 and some interest, a fact that reduced Josiah Hallam to silence for the better part of an afternoon. 13 of 4 and 20. A bare majority, held in one hand by a woman, in a company nobody wanted. She never let it go. Not that year, not in the bad spring. Not when the 9th was worth 4,000 a year and men came up from London with assay-books and open faces, and if you want the whole of her character in one line of a ledger, it is that one. The other 11 went, at £50 the share, to the only people in the Liberty who would take them, Mr. Frith, who took 2 and never afterwards would say why, and did not vote them once in 30 years, the 3 Bohm brothers of Sheffield, who took one between them out of Derbyshire obstinacy and a suspicion that they had sold Bright Hope too cheap. Her father, who took 4 and grumbled about it for a 12-month, a Chesterfield ironmonger who took 2 because his wife told him to, and Ambrose Redfern, who took 2 and who had no £50, and who was given them for his name. Redfern was 54, and had driven the last sough anybody in the Peak remembered, at Yatestoop, as a young man under his own father. He came down to the cupola in the January, filthy, civil, and entirely sceptical, and stood turning his hat while she put the plan in front of him, and told him what she meant to do, and he heard her all the way to the end, which is more than the Duke had done. And then he said the thing she had been waiting 3 months for somebody to say. "Who's to say the level of Ferrers' head? You are," she said. "Tomorrow, with a spirit level and a chain and 2 men, and I will hold the staff myself, and we will do it 3 times, and if the 3rd does not agree with the first, I will pay you and you may go home." They did it 4 times. It agreed. The head of Ferrers' soft stood 11 feet. 11, not 40. She had been out by 9 and 20 feet, and said so, out loud, in front of the men, in the flat voice of a person correcting a figure 11 feet below the standing water of the honeycomb. Not 40. 11, which meant the fall was thinner than she had thought and the driving must be truer, and which meant also that she had been right about the only thing that mattered, which was the direction. Redfern put his hat on. "I'll want 6 men," he said, "and a smith. And you'll not come down." "I shall come down every Thursday," said Miss Hallam, "and you may set your watch by it." They broke ground at Ferrers' Mouth on the 2nd of February, 1818, in a sleet that came sideways up the dale and drove into the hill. Of the 20 months that followed there is not much to say that would not want a book of its own, and the men who did it never said any of it, because a sophomman's entire opinion of his own work is contained in the word middling. They drove in the dark, in water, on their knees where the old arch had settled, 3 shifts, 6 men, a smith, a boy with the candles. They got forward some weeks 11 yards, and some weeks 19 inches. They hit a body of clay in the September that took 9 weeks, and every penny of the 3rd call to get through. They had a fall in the November that buried the forehead, and no man in it. By the grace of God and Redfern's habit of setting his props before he wanted them. And every Thursday, in a stuff gown and pattens and a hat she did not care about, Honor Hallam came a mile into the hill with a candle in her hand and a rule in her pocket, and measured the fall of the floor herself, and entered it, and went out again. The candles are worth a word. A softman carries a tallow dip, and he watches it the way a sailor watches the sky, because the flame is the only instrument in the world that will tell you what the air is doing. When it stands up bright, drive on. When it leans, mind. When it goes small and blue and sullen and will not take the wick, you go out, all of you now, and you do not stop to argue, because the hill has stopped lending you air. Redfern taught her that in her second week, and she wrote it in the book. She wrote everything in the book, and it is the one entry in the whole of the Suff accounts that is not a number. The Duke came in the April. He came alone, on a grey horse, up the dale on the Chesterfield road, and he had not meant to come at all. He had been at Bakewell about the coal, and had turned aside for 10 minutes out of what he would have called curiosity, and which was in fact the first symptom. He found the hazel thicket. He found the mouth of Ferrers' Soph with a rail across it, and a lamp on a nail, and a tally-board hung on the rock, and he found, sitting on a stone at the mouth in the rain, a woman in a wet grey stuff gown, eating bread and butter out of a cloth, and reading a sheet of figures. She got up. She curtsied. It was once again exactly the right curtsy, and it annoyed him very much, and he could not have told anybody why. Miss Hallam, Your Grace, you are still at it. We are at 490 yards from the mouth, sir, which is 61 yards of new ground since Candlemas. There are 149 yards to go. He had the whole answer ready. He had had it ready since Michaelmas. 149 yards of hard limestone is 2 years and a fortune, and a fortnight in the wet with a fever would finish her, and somebody ought to tell the old man. And then he looked past her, into the hill, down the arch of a tunnel a dead madman had built, and he saw, hanging on the wall at the entrance where every man going in must pass it, a board, and on the board, in a hand he had last seen at the foot of his own signature in the great book at Ashenhope, was the day's date, the names of the 6 men underground at that hour, the depth of water at the forehead, and the state of the air. The Duke of Harrowden had been managing an engine for 4 months. He did not know, and had never asked, the names of the men who were down his own shaft at that moment. He said something civil. He rode away. And that night, over his own port, with his own plans of his own mind spread out in front of him, he found himself doing a thing he had not done since he was a boy at Harrow, which was to check somebody else's arithmetic in the hope of finding it wrong. It was not wrong. That was the beginning of the whole trouble. Mr. Verrall did his sum in the June of 1818, and did not like it. He had watched her all spring the way a man watches a wasp in a room, and somewhere between the 400th yard and the 500th he had stopped finding her funny. 4p a ton on 19 miles of coal is a quiet income and a fragile one, and it rests upon a single proposition, which is that the water at Harrowden can be got out in no other manner. Mr. Verrall had defended that proposition for 11 years with the devotion of a bishop. He was not a wicked man. He was a man with one idea and an interest in it, which is a great deal more dangerous. And when he looked at Ferrers' mouth in the hazel thicket, he saw not a tunnel, but an auditor. So he read the custom. And the custom, which is pitiless in every direction, gave him a hatchet. A mine must be worked. That is the first law of the lead country, and the reason there is any lead in it. A man may not sit upon ground he does not dig. If, at the reckoning, the barmaster finds a set standing idle, he cuts a nick in the stows with his own hatchet, and at the second reckoning another, and at the third he cuts the third nick, and the mine is gone. Forfeit, out of that man's hand forever, and free to the next comer who asks for it. No notice, no appeal, no lawyer. And Sorrowful Grove, as Mr. Verrall pointed out to his master with a pencil, and to the steward with a bow, and to the 24 at the Michaelmas reckoning of 1818 with a fine air of public duty, Sorrowful Grove was not being worked at all. The lady was not mining. The lady was 3/4 of a mile away in another man's tunnel, playing at engineering. Her set stood idle, her stows stood bare, and the custom, which his grace had so lately and so handsomely upheld in this very room, must be allowed to take its course. It was very well done. It was, in fact, the best thing Ephraim Verrall ever did. And had it come off, his cousin at Bakewell was ready with £70 to free Sorrowful Grove the moment it fell, and Miss Hallam's 700 yards of finished stuff would have come to the Harroden estate for the price of a hatchet and a bow. The Duke, who did not know about the cousin and would have dismissed the man on the spot if he had, said only, "The custom is the custom. Verrall, if she is idle, she is idle. I am sorry for it." Mr. Frith closed the book, took his hatchet off the wall, and said that the court would walk up. They walked up. All of them, the steward, the barmaster, the 24 in their good coats, the Duke on his grey horse at a foot's pace, Verrall beside him, and half the parish behind, because a nicking is the only free entertainment in the lead country. It is 1.5 miles from the Moot Hall to Sorrowful Stows, uphill, and there was a wind off the moor with the first of the winter in it, and everybody was in excellent spirits. At the top at the Stows, they found 2 men and a boy, a windlass turning, a buddle running, and a heap of washed bouse on a clean-swept flag the size of a card table. The men were called Wager and Bohm. They had been there, the 2 of them, every working day for 20 months. They had not been driving the sough. They had been picking and washing the old hillocks of 1789, the tips the dead men had left, the rubbish nobody had troubled to look at in 26 years, and out of that rubbish they had been raising week upon week a small, steady, unglamorous parcel of perfectly good ore. Mr. Frith did not need to be told what to do. He had been doing it for 31 years. He sent for the dish. It came up the hill, in a sack on a boy's shoulder, the plain worn oblong brass trough out of the chest with the 3 locks, and Mr. Frith set it on the flag and filled it and struck it level with his hand and counted out loud, in the wind, while 24 sworn men and a duke stood round in a ring and watched. And it made 9 dishes, and a little over, which is 1 load, and a good one. "The mine is worked," said the barmaster. "There is no nick." And then he did the thing that finished it, because Roland Frith had been waiting 9 months for somebody to ask him a question in public, and nobody ever had. He turned to the steward and said that since the court was here, and the book was here, the court might as well have the reckonings of Sorrowful Grove read over, and he read them, 20 months of them. Every fortnight since the last day of September 1817, a parcel, measured in that dish at that Stows by that barmaster, entered in that book 9 shillings, 11 shillings, 7 and 6, 14 shillings, and against every one of them, duly counted out and duly received, the 13th dish. The lot, the Lord's own ancient right, the property of Julian Ashcourt, 4th Duke of Harrowden. He had been taking 9pence a fortnight off her since Michaelmas, for 20 months, and he had never once known it. The Duke sat his horse on the top of Ashenhope Hill in the wind and looked at a card table of washed stone and did the entire sum in about 4 seconds, because whatever else he was quick. She had read the custom before she stood up. She had read it before she asked. She had put 2 men on that hillock in the first week of October 1817, before ever a spade went into Ferrer's mouth, before the plan, before the calls, before anything, and paid them for 20 months, out of a company that had no income, to raise 9 shillings a fortnight of ore that she did not want, for no reason on earth, except that the custom said a mine must be worked, and she did not intend to lose her suff to a hatchet. 20 months. About £60. It was the cheapest insurance ever written in England, and it was written by a woman his own agent had described to him in this very month as a person playing at engineering. He looked for her and did not find her, because she was not there. She was a mile inside the hill, on her Thursday, with a candle and a rule, and had sent word by the boy that she was sorry to be from home, but that the court was very welcome, and Mr. Wager would answer for her. "Verall," said the Duke, in a voice several of the 24 remembered for a long while afterwards. "How many men are down my shaft this morning?" There was a pause of perhaps 3 seconds. "I could not say, Your Grace. I should have to send and ask the captain." "No," said the Duke. "You could not say. Nor could I." The county, which had been laughing for 13 months, now stopped laughing and began, which is far worse, to speculate. The chief instrument of this was Lady Belfield of Belfield Hall, widow, 70, the Duke's godmother, and the most industrious correspondent in the North Midlands, who had not been underground in her life and considered herself, on that account, admirably placed to explain the whole business to everybody. Her letters that winter are the best account we have of a man's conversion, largely because she was not trying to describe one, she was trying to describe a scandal, and kept accidentally describing a courtship instead. Harrowden dined here on Thursday. She wrote to her sister in the January, and was very dull until the fish, when your nephew observed that the Hallam creature had cut a vein in her tunnel at 620 yards, which has paid £1,100 and carried her through the clay. Upon which Harrowden put down his knife and talked for 19 minutes without stopping, and I could not follow one word in 5, and he was quite transformed, and I do not know what to make of it, and neither, my dear, does Georgiana. Miss Georgiana Loyne was 22, and possessed of £40,000, a coal fortune, a father with a coronet in his eye, and rather more penetration than anybody had ever asked her for. She had been brought to Harrowden 3 times that year. She had seen the engine, and the plans, and the ruined chapel, and she had watched her intended husband across a dinner table, while he explained the drainage of a hill to an old woman who was not listening, with his whole face alight. And she had drawn her conclusion with a briskness that would have done credit to an auditor. "He does not want me, Papa," she said, in the carriage, going home. "He wants my coal, and in about a 12-month he will not want that either. Nonsense, said Mr. Loyne. Papa, said Georgiana. He has never once asked me a question. They drove into the clay in the September of 1818, and out of it in the November, 1,100 pounds to the good from a vein the hill had thrown them by accident, and after that, the ground turned kind, and the forehead went forward through that winter, at a rate which made Ambrose Redfern nervous, because a softman distrusts nothing on earth so much as good luck. And here we come to the rule that saved 6 men's lives and the whole concern with them, and it was hers, and she made it in the first week, and she never once let it be broken. Bore ahead. At every round of shots, before ever a hole was charged, a man took the long iron boring rod and drove it 6 feet into the rock at the forehead, and turned it, and drew it, and looked at what came out on it, and reported, and it cost them a yard a week, every week, for 20 months, and the reason was this. Somewhere in front of them, in the dark, was a body of standing water in a honeycomb of dead men's tunnels. Nobody knew how much, nobody knew exactly where, and nobody had put a foot in it since 1789. If you break into a thing like that with a shot blind, it does not fill politely. It comes out of the hole in the rock the way it came out at Yatestoop in the year 86, and it takes the men, and the props, and the rails, and the candles, and a mile of tunnel, and it does not give any of them back. Redfern had said once in the first week that they might get on faster without it. A yard a week, Miss Hallam had said, is cheaper than 6 widows, and had written the rule in the book, and that was the end of the discussion for 20 months. On the 9th of May, 1819, at 1,398 yards from the mouth of Ferrers Sough, with 11 yards to go by her reckoning and 9 by Redfern's, a man named Josh Wager put the boring rod into the forehead, and it went in like a fork into a pudding. It went in 6 feet and wanted to go further, and when he pulled it out, the hill spat at him. It came out of a 3/4-inch hole with a noise nobody who was there ever cared to imitate. A solid black rod of water standing straight out of the rock across the tunnel and hammering the far wall, and it knocked Josh Wager's candle out, and his hat off, and very nearly Josh Wager, and the 6 of them went out of that hole a mile in the dark, on their hands and knees in a rising stream, with 1 candle among them, and got to the mouth, and stood in the hazel thicket in the rain and counted themselves, and there were 6. And then they turned round and looked at the mouth of the Sough, out of which, quietly, in a stream about the thickness of a man's arm, 26 years of standing water was walking away down the dale. She did not blast it. That is the thing to hold on to. That is the whole woman, in a sentence. She had 11 yards of rock between her and the end of the story, and a company screaming for its dues, and a county at the mouth by that evening, and she left the rock exactly where it was, and let the hill empty itself through a hole 3/4 of an inch across, for 11 days, because rock is a very good tap, and there is no sense throwing away a tap. 11 days. The stream at the mouth went from an arm to a leg to a barrel, and back to an arm again. And the Ashen ran ochre from Ashenhope to Rowsley, and the trout all died, and there is a paragraph about it in the Derby Mercury. And Redfern stood at the mouth every morning of those 11 days, with a stick marked in inches, and read the fall of it. And she entered it. And on the 11th day the flow steadied and slackened and went clear, and they lit their candles and walked back in, and took out the last 11 yards with 3 shots and a pick, and came, at noon, on the 21st of May, 1819, out of the end of Ferrers's Soff into the flooded and abandoned deep gate of Slack and Idle, in 6 inches of water, on a floor of clean-picked stone, 60 years after the last man who dug it had gone home. The hill was empty. All of it. The east end of Ashenhope, 6 mines, 400 years of workings, dry from the crest to the sump for the first time since Mr. Pitt was in his cradle, drained not by an engine, or a bucket, or a horse, or a pound of coal, but by a hole in the bottom of it, and the plain fact that water goes downhill. That was on the Friday. On the Tuesday following, the engine captain at the great rake at Harrowden, 3/4 of a mile away across 2 faults, and, according to Mr. Verrall, on its own water entirely, came up the field at a dead run to report that he had banked his fires on Sunday, for the boiler cleaning, and the sump had not risen. That it had not risen on Monday either, that it had in fact fallen 11 feet with the engine cold and standing, and that he could not account for it, and had never heard of such a thing, and had brought his levels up for his grace to see, because he did not expect to be believed. He did not send for her. That is worth saying, because every other man in the county would have sent for her, and because the fact that he did not is the exact point at which Julian Ashcourt stopped being the lord of the field and started being a man in a hurry. He rode down to the hazel thicket on the 2nd of June, alone, without Verrall, and he found the rail and the lamp and the tally board and the woman, and he took off his hat and asked whether he might be permitted to see it. "You may," said Miss Hallam. "You will want a coat you do not love. And you must do as Mr. Redfern tells you, sir, and not as you like, or I shall put you out." "Understood," said the Duke of Harrowden. "It is a mile. It takes an hour, stooping, and it is black, and it is loud with running water, and the account of what he saw comes to us from Redfern, who walked behind him with the candles, and who was not a man given to embroidery, and it is very short." He said the Duke did not speak for the first half-mile. He said that at about 600 yards his Grace stopped and put his hand up on the arch, on the cut stone Ferrers' men had set 30 years before, and stood there a while. He said that at the junction where the dead madman's tunnel ran out and the new driving began, the Duke asked one question, which was how they had held the line, and that Miss Hallam told him the rise of 1 inch in the chain, checked at every 20 yards, 411 separate levellings entered in the book, the greatest error over 1,400 yards being 3 inches and a half, and that his Grace laughed once in the dark, and that it was not the laugh from the Moot Hall. And he said that the Duke stood at the forehead, in water over his boots, with his hat in his hand like a man in church, and listened to the hill running out, and said nothing at all for a long time. At the end of it, in the deep gate of Slack and Idle, 60 years drowned and now standing dry, there was a corf, a wooden basket on a sledge, half full, left exactly where the water had caught the men of 1789 and sent them up the shaft with their lives and nothing else. The bouse in it was still there. It had been sitting in 6 feet of standing water since the year the Bastille came down, and it was as bright as the day it was broken. She picked a lump out of the corf and held it out to him across the running water. He took his glove off to take it. Neither of them remarked on it, not then, and not for a year and a half, and Redfern, who saw it, never mentioned it to a living soul until he was very old. And then the Duke of Harrowden nearly dropped it, because nobody who has not handled galena is prepared for the weight of it. A lump the size of a fist that comes up off the palm like a shot from a fowling piece, dense, dead, silver grey, cubed like something built rather than grown. He turned it over twice. He weighed it in his hand. And the argument he had been having with a hill since the June his brother died concluded, quietly, then and there, without any further business. "How much of this is there?" he said. "In the East End? Mr. Redfern says 2,000 loads standing that a boy could carry away. In the rake?" She paused, because she was honest, and because a number given to a man like that had better be right. "I do not know, sir. Nobody has ever seen the bottom of your rake. Your grandfather did not stop sinking because the vein failed. He stopped because the water came up faster than the engine could take it down. It has not failed. It has been waiting. Since when? Since about 1781 by my father's book." The Duke looked at the lump in his bare hand for a moment. "My family," he said, "has lifted the water out of that hill for 38 years. 900,000 tons of it. Near enough. At something above 100,000 pounds, if the coal bills are honest, which they are not. And it was never necessary." "It was never necessary," said Miss Hallam. "It only had to be let out." There was rather a long silence, in which the sough ran, and a candle guttered, and Ambrose Redfern examined the roof with the air of a man who has suddenly remembered a great deal of pressing business elsewhere. "There is a thing I must tell you," she said, "and I would rather you had it from me than from Mr. Frith at my Kelmas. The 9th lies upon the great rake now. It began on the Sunday. Your captain banked his fires. Every load you raise out of that mine from this day forward is measured in the dish at your own stows, and 1 dish in 9 of it is mine, and it is taken before your lot, and it runs as long as the water runs, which is forever." "I know," said the Duke. "I told you," she said. "You told me," he said in open court, on the last day of September, in the year 1817, and you had it entered under the grant, above the names, and I said quite, and signed it, and went to my dinner." He handed the lump of galena back to her, and his voice was perfectly level, which those who knew him understood to be the worst sign there was. "Miss Hallam, I have read that entry 11 times since Tuesday. There is not a syllable in it you did not say to my face. You did not trap me. You warned me, in the plainest English in Derbyshire, in front of 24 witnesses, and I laughed, and the laugh is in the minute book too, or it ought to be. I would not have it said afterwards that I had not told you. No," he said, "you would not. The reckoning at my Kelmas, 1819, was attended by more people than had come to any court at Ashenhope since the Jubilee, and they did not come for the pleas. They came to watch the dish go round at the great rake. And it went round exactly as it had gone round in that liberty for 300 years, in the wind, on the flags at the stow's head, with the Barmaster filling it and striking it level with his hand and counting out loud, and at every 9th dish Mr. Frith said soft, and a boy tipped it into the sow's pile, and at every 13th of what remained he said lot, and a boy tipped it into the Duke's, and her pile was the bigger, and it was the bigger in front of the whole county. And the Duke of Harrowden stood in the ring of men, and watched it happen to himself, with his hands behind his back, and no expression whatever. What he did afterwards was less public and a good deal worse for Mr. Verrall. He asked her for the assay-book. She gave him the whole 11 volumes, in a wheelbarrow, with a note saying he might have them as long as he liked, and that the 4th was misfoliated. And he sat down with them and with his own coal accounts, and did at 34 the one thing his father and his grandfather had never done, which was to check. It took him 9 days. At the end of it he had a single sheet of paper with 2 columns on it, and he sent for Ephraim Verrall, and he did not raise his voice. And Verrall was out of the house before the light went, and out of the county before the month. There was no prosecution. There is never a prosecution in these cases. There is merely a man who used to be somebody, standing in the yard at Bakewell, explaining to people who have stopped listening. His cousin's carts went on down the moor for a while, carrying nothing, and then stopped too. The county, which likes a villain, was disappointed, and said so. He came to the cupola on the 14th of November, and he made a mess of it, and it is only fair to him to say that he made a mess of it out of an excess of respect, which is the commonest way there is. He had thought about it for 6 weeks. He had thought about it, being the man he was, in columns, and what he had arrived at, and what he laid before her in her father's counting-house with the assay-book still stacked in the corner where the barrow had left it, was a settlement, that they should marry, that the 9th should be brought into the marriage as her portion, valued by an honest man and secured upon the Harrowden estate, that the whole should be put, as he phrased, upon a proper footing, so that the county need never again be treated to the spectacle of a duke's oar being counted out at his own stows into another person's pile. He believed he was offering her everything he had. In a sense he was. He simply had not noticed that the last clause was the only one he had thought about for 6 weeks, and that it was an apology to the county, and that it was to be paid for out of her. Honor Hallam heard him all the way to the end of the sentence. She always did. "Your Grace," she said, "you are not offering me your hand. You are offering to buy my 9th and call it a wedding. That is not. It is the only clause with a figure in it," she said. "I have read a great many settlements, sir. The figures are the sentences that are meant." She stood up, and she was not angry, and that was the dreadful part. She was as level as she had been in the Moot Hall. "I did not drive that stuff to be tidied away. I have been laughed at in that room and nicked at by your agent, and I have been a mile under that hill on a Thursday for 20 months, and at the end of it the custom of this liberty gave me a thing that is mine, and the first proposal I receive in my life is an offer to take it off me and give me a title instead, so that your neighbors may be comfortable. No, sir, I thank you, and I am for Hull on Tuesday about the pig lead." She curtsied. It was the same curtsy, exact, unhurried, precisely the depth the occasion required, and not 1 degree deeper, and then she went out to the furnace to see about a charge, because there was a charge to see about, and left the 4th Duke of Harrowden standing alone in a smelter's counting-house at Ashenhope with his hat in his hands for the 2nd time in 6 months. She went to Hull on the Tuesday. She was gone 6 weeks. It was not a flounce. There were 1,100 pigs of lead to be shipped, and a factor to be argued with, and she had been putting it off since the holing. But it did the work of a flounce, and Lady Belfield's correspondence for that Christmas is very nearly unreadable with excitement. He wrote to her 19 times. Not one of them was a love letter. He did not know how, and he had the sense to know he did not know. What he wrote instead, to Hull, to the George at Doncaster, to Ashenhope when she came back and would not see him, was questions. Whether the rake ought to be sunk on the old line or thrown east at the fault. What her father's book said about the ground below the 90 fathom. Whether she thought a second sough might be driven to the West End, and what she would want for it, and whether she would take it on. What a fair rate was for a hillock picker in a wet winter, because he had discovered that he had been paying his men one, and Wager and Bohm another, and that hers was the higher, and he wished to know why. Whether she would look at the enclosed and tell him where it was wrong. She answered every one. Of course she did. And somewhere in that stack of paper, nobody has ever been able to say exactly where, and they were both far too dry ever to be asked. A man who had settled a question at 34 unsettled it, and a woman who had never in her life been asked what she thought by anybody with a coronet discovered that she had a very great deal to say, and somebody to say it to. Georgiana Loyne married her father's chief engineer in the March, and was extremely happy, and said afterwards that she had had a narrow escape, and meant it kindly. The Barmote sat at Easter, 1820, in the Moot Hall at Ashenhope, the steward at the head of the table, the Barmaster at his right hand with the great book open, the 24 on the benches, the chest with the 3 locks standing open, and the dish on the table where it always lay because it outranked everybody in the room. And when the pleas were done, the lord of the field stood up, which no lord of that field had done in living memory, and asked leave of the court to enter a matter in the book. Read the entry of the last day of September 17, he said. All of it, the grant, and the caution, and the names. Mr. Frith read it. It took a minute and a half, and the room was very quiet, and when he came to the 4 lines of caution, 1 water, and a sough which draws the one will draw the other, and I would not have it said afterwards that I had not told you, there was not a man on those benches looking at the table. Enter this under it, said the Duke of Harrowden, that the 9th dish of Hallam's sough is the freehold of Honor Hallam of Ashenhope, her heirs and assigns for ever, that it is not redeemable, that it may not be bought, compounded, released, extinguished, or taken in marriage settlement by me, nor by any Duke of Harrowden after me, nor by any person claiming under us, though she should ask it herself, and that this court is to refuse us if we ever try. He waited while Frith's pen caught up. I laughed at this woman in this room before all of you, and I signed her grant for a joke, and the custom did not laugh. It has cost me 2,000 a year, and it has saved me 40. I am not able to make that right, and I do not propose to try. I am only concerned that it should be impossible for any Ash Court ever to take it back. And then, having removed the last thing he had to bargain with, in front of 24 sworn men and a Barmaster and a county, and having nothing whatever left to offer, he turned round to the bench at the back where the smelters and the chapmen sat, and asked her. She let him finish. She always did. Your Grace, said Honor Hallam, does not ask a question badly. They were married in the September, quietly at Ashenhope, and Ambrose Redfern gave her away, on the grounds that Josiah Hallam's gout was very bad that autumn, and that somebody had to, and he wore a coat nobody had ever seen before and was miserable in it for 4 hours. The great rake was sunk another 80 fathom on the old line, and paid, in the 20 years following, better than it had paid in the whole of the 18th century, and every load of it went through the brass dish at the stow's head, and every 9th dish of it was counted out to the Duchess of Harrowden before her husband got his lot. And he never once, in 31 years, asked her to spare him the ceremony. He said he liked to watch it. There is a note in his hand in the assay-book against the reckoning of 1834, and all it says is, "Soff, 411 loads. Cheap at the price. Ferrer's mouth is in the hazel thicket still. You may find it, if you know the dale and do not mind wet feet, and the water is still coming out of it, quietly, in a stream about the thickness of a man's arm, as it has come out every hour of every day for 200 years, having never once been asked to, and never once been paid, and never once stopped. He never beat it. No man ever has." She simply went down to the bottom of the hill and opened a door, and the water walked out of it and has been walking ever since, and paying her rent for the privilege of going, and the mad dead man's tunnel that the whole county rode past for 26 years on its way to admire a duke's engine kept, in the end, the only name that was ever put on it. The dish knew no names. The soff kept one. Don't forget to like and subscribe, or at least leave a comment if you enjoyed the story.